Are you a Pride and Prejudice fan? Because if so, have I got an opinion for you? I am about to make the argument that Caroline Bingley is Pride and Prejudice's MVP, which stands for Most Valuable Player, for those of you who are not familiar. Yes, indeed, a scalding hot take on a novel published in 1813. That is the kind of timely content you can expect around here. And if you're not a Pride and Prejudice fan, this may not be your video. I will try to explain as we go on, but it's complicated. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Pride and Prejudice, I know that you're thinking, wait, Caroline Bingley? She's mean, catty, horrible, rude, she's after Mr. Darcy. And while many of these things are true, not all of them are irretrievable flaws, and you have to admit that Caroline does a lot to bring Lizzie and Darcy together. That she didn't intend to is what provides the entertainment value, because in this, she provides a foil to not only Lizzie, but also to Mrs. Bennet. But a little bit more on that later. The plot of Pride and Prejudice goeth thusly. A rich young man called Bingley, his sisters, his brother-in-law, and his even richer but snootier friend Darcy come to Hertfordshire. Bingley has rented Netherfield Park, which is quite near the town of Meryton, and people are hyped. In particular, all the single ladies of Meryton and its surrounding environs want a piece of this action. But the one Mr. Bingley seems to take a shine to the most is the eldest of the Bennet sisters, Jane, who is both the pretty one and the nice one. Everyone in the family is hopeful that she will marry Mr. Bingley because the Bennet estate is entailed upon Mr. Collins, a cousin, and they're gonna be out on their ears when their father dies, and they don't have very much money. Anyway, Lizzie, second Bennet sister and the witty one, is slighted by Mr. Darcy, who says she's not that pretty, and decides that he's not very nice. Reasonably enough. Darcy, who is admittedly only trying to help his friend, just not very well, meddles to keep Jane and Bingley apart, falls in love with Lizzie, against his own wishes, proposes in a spectacular and frankly insulting fashion, and gets turned down, which he was not expecting. Lizzie has a fancy for a dashing soldier called Mr. Wickham, who claims that Darcy has treated him terribly. As it turns out, first, that's not really what happened, and second, Wickham tends to like them younger. Like, he tried to elope with Darcy's sister when the sister was 15, and he eventually ends up marrying Lizzie's sister, who was barely 16 at the time. He's about 27 at this point. Yeah. A lot of other things happen. There are many shenanigans, but the upshot is that at the end, Jane and Bingley get married, and Lizzie and Darcy get married, and it all ends relatively happily for most of the people involved. So Caroline. Caroline is Mr. Bingley's unmarried sister. He has two sisters, Caroline and Louisa, but Louisa is married to a Mr. Hurst, a man of more fashion than fortune, we are told in the novel. In the 2005 adaptation, Caroline is Mr. Bingley's only sister, like they axed Mrs. Hurst just to make things a bit simpler. But regardless, Caroline is to keep house for her brother, which unmarried sisters often did for single men until they find a wife. So there's a little bit of a conflict of interest between Caroline and Jane, is what I'm saying. Also one between Caroline and Lizzie, because Darcy likes Lizzie. He doesn't seem very interested in Caroline. Bingley's sisters were fine women with an air of decided fashion, in contrast to the more rural Bennet sisters. And Caroline and Louisa aren't the worst people ever, but they're not terribly nice. They were, in fact, very fine ladies, not deficient in good humour when they were pleased, nor in the power of being agreeable where they chose it, but proud and conceited. They were rather handsome, had been educated in one of the first private seminaries in town, had a fortune of £20,000, were in the habit of spending more than they ought, and of associating with people of rank, and were therefore in every respect entitled to think well of themselves and meanly of others. They were of a respectable family in the north of England, a circumstance more deeply impressed on their memories than that their brother's fortune and their own had been acquired by trade. Now, almost as soon as we meet Caroline Bingley, we see that she has her eye on Darcy. The fact that she looks down on Jane, whose father is indeed a gentleman, even though she herself is setting her cap at someone much higher up the social ladder than Mr. Bingley, is, well, humans are inherently a little bit hypocritical, are we not? Miss Bennet, that is, Darcy, acknowledged to be pretty, but she smiled too much. Mrs. Hurst and her sister allowed it to be so, but still they admired her and liked her, and pronounced her to be a sweet girl, and one whom they should not object to know more of. The Bingley sisters don't hate Jane, or Lizzie for that matter, but they do feel superior to them. Mind you, they feel superior to basically everyone, so it's not like Jane and Lizzie are being singled out here. Miss Bennet's pleasing manners grew on the goodwill of Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and though the mother was found to be intolerable and the younger sisters not worth speaking to, a wish of being better acquainted with them was expressed towards the two eldest. However, as I said, Caroline Bingley clearly has her eye on Darcy, and that brings her into conflict with Lizzie. Though I feel we must pause here and say that Caroline fancying Mr. Darcy, even if it is for slightly mercenary motives, is just good sense. I mean, Charlotte marries Mr. Collins, and we generally do not look down on her for this, but Caroline is setting her sights rather higher with someone who is clearly clever, and rich, and well-connected, and why wouldn't you, if you could, is what I'm saying here. He's friends with her brother, and so she knows his character, and she seems to know and like his little sister. Mind you, Georgiana is a sweetie, and everybody likes Georgiana, so maybe that doesn't say too much, but still, you know, they have things in common. But it's here with Caroline's relationship to Mr. Darcy that we get to the meat of my hypothesis about Caroline being the secret MVP here. Because every time Caroline tries to reach out to Darcy, to connect, to flirt, to kind of force team with him, ugh, these people. He doesn't notice, or it doesn't work, or he even pushes back, mostly because he's already a little bit smitten with Lizzie. At the beginning of the novel, please note that he's not seriously besotted with her in a way that would make him consider marrying her. But, you know, she's pretty and witty, and he likes to listen to her and look at her. We're going to see quite a lot of Caroline and Lizzie and Darcy in chapters 6 to 11, so you will forgive me if this part is exhaustive, but if that's what you like in your character analysis, you're in the right place. But to really understand Caroline's interactions, we must first start with Darcy. Occupied in observing Mr. Bingley's attentions to her sister, Elizabeth was far from suspecting that she was herself becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend. Mr. Darcy had first scarcely allowed her to be pretty. He had looked at her without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticise. Rude. But no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she had hardly a good feature in her face, than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. To this discovery succeeded some others, equally mortifying. Of this she was perfectly unaware. To her, he was only the man who made himself agreeable nowhere, and who had not thought her handsome enough to dance with. Shortly after the revelation to the reader of Darcy's feelings, we are at the Lucases. In the book, Charlotte makes Lizzie play the piano, from which she is succeeded by Mary, who plays some concertos and then some dancing music. Sir William Lucas has the fine idea of getting Lizzie and Darcy to dance, which Lizzie is not having. Like, we're not having it. I know this video is about Caroline, but I enjoy how this is part of a rule of three that we're setting up. First, Darcy is told by Bingley that he should dance with Lizzie, and he says, no. Second, Sir William Lucas says, Darcy, Lizzie, you should dance, and Lizzie says, no. And third, Darcy invites Lizzie to dance with him, and she can't think of a reason to say no. So they end up dancing. Incidentally, the looks that Darcy and Lizzie give each other here in the miniseries, 10 out of 10, I love them so much. It is a masterclass in very subtle facial expressions, because you can tell that at this moment they are in sympathy, even though they have completely opposite goals, because Darcy wants to dance with Lizzie and Lizzie does not want to dance with Darcy. They nonetheless, they're feeling a little bit of simpatico, you know. Mr. Darcy is all politeness, said Elizabeth, smiling. He is indeed, but considering the inducement, my dear Miss Eliza, we cannot wonder at his complaisance, for who would object to such a partner? Elizabeth looked archly and turned away. Her resistance had not injured her with the gentleman, and he was thinking of her with some complacency when thus accosted by Miss Bingley. I can guess the subject of your reverie. I should imagine not. Poor Caroline. She never stood a chance, not really. She's hoping for some mutual complaining about how awful the evening is, but Darcy isn't finding the evening awful because Lizzie. And while, as we previously saw, he had been willing to indulge in some Lizzie bashing, when she tries to do this again, we get quite a different response. I have been meditating on the very great pleasure which a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow. I absolutely love how he just tells her that. I mean, I don't know, perhaps it is my prejudices, but I was not expecting this kind of emotional honesty from a Regency gentleman, I'm going to be honest. Hey man, what you thinking about? Pretty girl over there. Okay. Honestly, Caroline, I am all astonishment too. But of course, this makes Lizzie a direct threat, and so Caroline decides to head it off at the pass by being absurd. Miss Elizabeth Bennet, repeated Miss Bingley. I am all astonishment. How long has she been such a favourite? And pray, when am I to wish you joy? That is exactly the question which I expected you to ask. A lady's imagination is very rapid. It jumps from admiration to love, from love to matrimony in a moment. I knew you would be wishing me joy. Nay, if you are so serious about it, I shall consider the matters absolutely settled. You will have a charming mother-in-law indeed, and of course she will be always at Pemberley with you. He listened to her with perfect indifference, while she chose to entertain herself in this manner, and as his composure convinced her that all was safe, her wit flowed long. She's trying so hard here, and it's actively working against her. I love it. As I said, Darcy clearly fancies Lizzie, it's right here in the text. But since he is a gentleman and frankly way above her in social standing, he's not bothered to do anything about it. He's just trying to hang around her. Why not? Caroline, blithering on about how happy they're going to be together, does nothing but give him leave to think about Lizzie some more, while being provided with some Caroline-shaped background noise. Of course, we understand why Caroline is doing this. I mean, one, positive attention directed to a woman who is not her is a threat, but two, positive attention directed at a woman who Darcy has no intention of marrying suggests that Darcy is unlikely to be bowled over and immediately propose to someone if he doesn't think that it's a good idea. Even if he thinks that woman is pretty. Which isn't the best for Caroline, because I think she's hoping for kind of a Mr. and Mrs. Bennet situation. Though obviously she wouldn't think of it like that. But Mrs. Bennet was formerly, probably Jane, Gardiner, and she came from a respectable but not aristocratic family. She married up. Mr. Bennet married beneath his station because she was pretty and she liked him and it was great, and then it turned out that that was actually kind of a bad idea. Not because she was below him socially, but because they're not very compatible. They're not very compatible, really, in the long run. Like, they make it work and it's okay, but they're not, you know, there may have been better choices available, is what I'm saying. Speaking of Mrs. Bennet, in chapter 7 we get possibly the only time, I'm not quite sure, that Mrs. Bennet's machinations actually give her the desired effect. Jane is invited to come and dine with Caroline and Louisa. Mrs. Bennet insists that she goes on horseback instead of in the carriage because it looks like rain and then you'll have to stay the night, and it does rain. And Jane gets quite ill. Lizzie, upon hearing this, then walks 3 miles in what we must assume is not amazing weather in order to visit Jane at Netherfield. And she ends up staying there for a few days, which she largely spends preoccupied by Jane, but we do get some fantastic scenes with Caroline and Bingley and Darcy and Lizzie all together, just wonderful. Honestly, the stay at Netherfield and Caroline's interference at this point is hugely influential. If Lizzie hadn't gone to stay, if Jane hadn't got sick, you know, this would never have happened. Things would probably have turned out quite differently. So in chapter 8 we get another example of Caroline trying to needle Darcy about Lizzie and not succeeding at all. "I am afraid, Mr. Darcy," observed Miss Bingley in a half-whisper, "that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes." "Not at all," he replied. They were brightened by the exercise. When they meet together in the evenings, Caroline attempts to make Lizzie seem boring and unaccomplished in comparison to her, but it fails spectacularly and makes Darcy like her more. Again, like, she's doing my job for me here. And honestly, at this point, when we reach the scene about the accomplished woman, I think that Darcy is doing it on purpose. "Miss Eliza Bennet," said Miss Bingley, "despises cards. She is a great reader and has no pleasure in anything else." "You're so boring, Lizzie, so boring. Not like me. I'm accomplished." And this, of course, is the part of the scene where Austen describes Miss Bingley as Darcy's faithful assistant. "Oh, certainly," cried his faithful assistant. "No one can be really esteemed accomplished who does not greatly surpass what is usually met with. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, dancing, drawing, and the modern languages to deserve the word. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved." "All this she must possess," added Darcy, "and to all this she must yet add something more substantial, in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading." It is at this point in the 2005 adaptation that Lizzie, who has been sitting with an open book, slams it shut. Lizzie, of course, is a bit incredulous that someone would need to be all of these things in order to be an accomplished woman, whereupon the Bingley sisters say, "We know loads of women like that. It's just because you don't know anyone, you peasant." They don't quite put it like that. But then Caroline, dear, sweet Miss Bingley, has the audacity to say this. "Eliza Bennet," said Miss Bingley, when the door was closed on her, because like we can't even wait till she's definitely out of earshot, just as soon as the door closes, is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own, and with many men I dare say it succeeds, but in my opinion it is a paltry device, a very mean art. Undoubtedly, replied Darcy, to whom this remark was chiefly addressed. There is meanness in all the arts which ladies sometimes condescend to employ for captivation. Whatever bears affinity to cunning is despicable. Miss Bingley was not so entirely satisfied with this reply as to continue the subject. Thwarted again, Caroline. This is probably the point where I should say, if you have never read the book, I highly recommend it, or if you're not really a reading person, there are lots of different audiobook versions, and since it's in the public domain, some of them are free. Like, legally free. So, you know, I'm just saying. You might enjoy it. There is a lot of quite pointed humour that even the 5-hour miniseries cannot quite encapsulate. In chapter 9, Mrs. Bennet and the younger Bennet sisters come to visit, and it's a bit of a... it's not quite a train wreck, but it's not great. Mr. Darcy says, quite rudely, to be honest, that the countryside society is confined and unvarying, and Mrs. Bennet goes off on one.
Confined? And unvarying indeed it is not.
Lizzie tries to redirect her, but, you know, mothers. And then afterwards we get another example of Caroline slanging them behind their backs, but in spite of all Miss Bingley's witticisms on fine eyes, Darcy won't join in and slang Lizzie. Sorry. I mean, if Caroline only knew, she doesn't need to rag on the Bennets. Darcy knows perfectly well that they're quite an embarrassment. Having decided that this tactic is clearly not working, it's having the opposite effect. In fact, in chapters 10 and 11, Caroline has another couple of goes at, some different tactics. Honestly, the tactic in chapter 10 is liable to make Darcy hate her. There are few minor annoyances which enrage me more egregiously than someone interrupting me when I'm trying to write something. As I not infrequently tell the second smallest bear up, the smallest one being Nemo, obviously, if you keep interrupting me while I'm trying to write the thing to ask me when it's finished, it's going to take 10 times longer than it otherwise would, because every time you interrupt, I have to figure out where I was in my train of thought. Elizabeth took up some needlework, and was sufficiently amused in attending to what passed between Darcy and his companion. The perpetual commendations of the lady, either on his handwriting, or on the evenness of his lines, or on the length of his letter, with the perfect unconcern with which her praises were received, formed a curious dialogue, and was exactly in unison with her opinion of each. After this, in the book, there's a fairly lively exchange between Lizzie and Darcy until Bingley calls them off, at which point Lizzie says, "What you ask," said Elizabeth, "is no sacrifice on my side, and Mr. Darcy had much better finish his letter." When he has finished his letter, Darcy then applies to the ladies for some music, and the Bingley sisters sing duets and accompany themselves on the piano, but Mr. Darcy is still staring at Lizzie. Mrs. Hurst sang with her sister. Elizabeth could not help observing, as she turned over some music books that lay on the instrument, how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. Poor old Caroline. Darcy requests music, she provides music, and still he's just staring at the lady with the pretty eyes. At which point Darcy and Lizzie have another little bit of witty banter. Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry, but there was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner which made it difficult for her to affront anybody, and Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. He really believed that were it not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger. Miss Bingley saw, or suspected enough to be jealous. There follows an instance where Caroline and Mr. Darcy go walking and they don't tell the others that they're going, so they do meet Mrs. Hurst and Lizzie, who have come out after them, and then Mrs. Hurst takes Darcy's other arm, and he feels really bad about that. Because, you know, the path is not wide enough to admit 4 people, and so he feels the rudeness of it. But Lizzie's like, no, go on ahead, it's great. You guys, you do your thing, you look so wonderful. Bye! And just runs off, basically. And now you're walking up the path, arm in arm with 2 women, Mr. Darcy, and probably you're still thinking about Lizzie, who gets to go, like, have fun on her own. In chapter 11, Caroline tries to apply some art, you know, the little grey cells. She knows that Darcy is into reading, and he's reading, and so she picks up the second volume of the novel that he is currently addressing. But reading is quite a solitary activity, and Mr. Darcy is just paying her no attention, so... Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example and take a turn about the room. I assure you, it is very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude. Elizabeth was surprised, but agreed to it immediately. Miss Bingley succeeded no less in the real object of her civility. Mr. Darcy looked up. He was as much awake to the novelty of attention in that quarter as Elizabeth herself could be, and unconsciously closed his book. You're not more interesting than Darcy's novel, Caroline, but he thinks that Lizzie is. Sorry. And then, of course, Lizzie and Darcy get into another conversation slash discussion slash argument about faults, until Caroline interrupts them with, "Shall we have some music?" Probably for the best, honestly. Even Darcy's thinking so. He began to feel the danger of paying Elizabeth too much attention. 4 days in the same house as her and he's already halfway in love with her. Elizabeth Bennet! Charisma 18. Funnily enough, it's chapter 18 when we get back to Caroline again. Bingley is holding a ball at Netherfield, and Lizzie, in hopes of dancing with Mr. Wickham and maybe doing a little bit of flirting, has dressed with more than usual care. But she finds Mr. Wickham not present and is, unfortunately, obliged to dance at least the first 2 with Mr. Collins. He cannot dance. It's very painful. I would like to point out at this juncture, for those of you who have read my novel Just Stab Me Now, yes, Caroline Lindley is basically named after Caroline Bingley, and Captain Collins is named after Mr. Collins because I think that the surname Collins is a lovely surname and was in need of some rehabilitation. I had an editor say, "Collins makes me think of Mr. Collins, are you going to change his surname?" And I was like, no. Anyway, oh shoot, Mr. Darcy comes over and it's the 3rd time that we've talked about Darcy and Lizzie dancing, but this time they actually have to do it. And then Lizzie deliberately talks to Darcy while they're dancing because she thinks he will like that less. And they get into another argument, which Darcy soon forgives her for because she's so pretty and witty and all of the things. And also because he knows that Wickham has probably been pouring poison in her ear about him. But then we get this exchange between Caroline and Lizzie. "So, Miss Eliza, I hear you are quite delighted with George Wickham." It goes poorly.
Excuse my interference. It was kindly meant.
And do you know something? I think that might actually be true. This might be the one kind of decent thing that Caroline does, and it does more to hurt Lizzie's relationship with Darcy than anything, ironically. Caroline knows that Darcy and Wickham have some kind of bad history. If she wanted Darcy to like Lizzie less, then surely pushing Lizzie towards Mr. Wickham would be the thing to do, but, like, we're showing a little bit of solidarity here. Wickham is clearly a wrong'un. Caroline doesn't know why he's a wrong'un, but she knows that he is one, and so, that she chooses to tell Lizzie this in the least tactful, useful way possible is, you know, well, it's Caroline. But she tried. She tried, and she didn't have to, and I think that this is possibly the one thing that actually speaks well for her here. Though again, ironically, this is the one thing that she does do that helps to keep Lizzie and Darcy apart. Now, I wrote this book, which is called Just Stab Me Now, and it is about an author whose name is Caroline Lindley, and she is writing a romantasy enemies to lovers thing, or she's trying, but her characters are too sensible to do what she wants them to do. And when I started making the videos on which the eventual novel was based, Caroline was hated, like just loathed by a significant proportion of people because she was trying to shove romance at this heroine, at Rosamond, who didn't want it. She was not on board with this. Caroline's gleeful and ineffectual Mrs. Bennet-like machinations made people hate her. But, you know, first of all, Caroline is playing around with characters who are imaginary, so I'm just saying. But also, her heart is in the right place. She doesn't necessarily express it very well, but her heart's in the right place. And she has her own issues, which are alluded to in the series, but which you kind of get into a little bit more in the book. And speaking of the book, this seems like an opportune moment to say that if you are in the southeast of England, on Wednesday the 23rd of October, I will be in Canterbury Waterstones in Rose Lane at 6:30 p.m. talking about books. Like, do you enjoy me talking randomly about books for ages? Well, this might be the event for you. Tickets are £5, or if you want to get a ticket and a book, I think it's like £17. I don't know who gets that money, it's probably not me, but you know, that's how much the tickets are, and there will be a link in the pinned comment and the description to the Eventbrite thing that lets you book. If you're not in the area, you may still enjoy Just Stab Me Now, particularly chapter 5, which is where Caroline gets to indulge her kind of Regency romance shenanigans, because chapter 5 contains the memory of Rosamond when she was much younger, meeting her first husband at a ball. And they talk about books. I'm just saying. Also, I'm filming this before I will know, but hopefully by the time we get here, there will be audiobook news for you, so I don't know if it's going to appear on the screen, or if I'm suddenly going to change my appearance entirely and tell you about the audiobook. We'll find out. Look, I'm not going to say the audiobook is cursed, exactly, but things have been breaking, which has not been ideal. I don't have an update for you except to say that some of the chapters are now done. I feel like we're more than a third of the way through, but things continue to be a bit dicey, so every time we think that it's going well, something else goes a bit wrong. It will be out, I hope, by the end of the year, but further than that, I'm afraid I do not have any news for you. I do love sponsoring my own videos, it's great. Anyway, onward to Caroline Bingley's next super smart machination, which is actually a reasonably clever one, honestly, which is her and Darcy decide that Bingley has to leave Netherfield. He has to go back to London. They have to get him out of Jane's way because they don't want him hooking up with Jane in a, you know, Regency approved kind of way, obviously. Bingley leaving makes Jane very sad, especially when Caroline writes to Jane to say, "Oh, it's so lovely to meet Georgiana again. Isn't Georgiana great? It would be so wonderful if Georgiana married my brother. Wouldn't that be awesome?" Lizzie is massively irritated by this, coming as it does on the heels of the Mr. Collins proposal. So when the Gardeners come for Christmas and they say, "Why don't we take Jane back to town with us?" Lizzie says, "Yeah, I think that's a great idea." I love the Gardeners. I would make an argument that the Gardeners are, you know, really up there in terms of MVPs for Pride and Prejudice, but they mostly appear in, you know, the second part of the book. They don't lay the groundwork. They are very much recipients of the midpoint change in Darcy's outward personality, if not in his fundamental character. Anyway, from this we know that 1, Caroline never really cared for Jane very much, which we kind of knew anyway, but 2, we now also know that Mr. Darcy is in London and he's still hanging out with Mr. Bingley. Yep. This may be important. And so a couple of months pass, and because Mr. Collins eventually married Charlotte, Lizzie's best friend, instead, they've gone off to Kent, so her best friend's gone, and Jane is obviously in London, so Jane's gone, so Lizzie's feeling a little bit lonely and goes in March to visit Charlotte in Kent. And Mr. Collins as well, I guess. They're only in Kent a couple of weeks, when who should show up at Lady Catherine's house because he's Lady Catherine's nephew than Mr. Darcy and his cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam. I love Colonel Fitzwilliam, he's great. Lizzie is absolutely here for the steaming hot gossip because she wants to see if Miss Bingley is likely to catch Darcy because, you know, she's heard rumours that Miss de Bourgh and Darcy are supposed to be sort of meant for each other. But she looks at Darcy and Anne de Bourgh and she sees them interacting, like, don't see that he particularly likes her. Or that she particularly likes him, to be honest. But we do get the delight of Lizzie playing the piano and simultaneously sassing Mr. Darcy. This does not involve Caroline at all, but I mention it because it makes me feel a bit sorry for Caroline, who can play the piano extremely well, by all accounts, but she can't play and sass at the same time. I have recently taken up playing the piano again at the ripe old age of 38, and I am enjoying it immensely because I am able to accompany myself while singing, but it's very hard to play and sing at the same time, so playing and sassing seems just beyond me, honestly, at the moment. Lizzie, however, can sass everybody in equal measure, and even though she doesn't like Darcy, she's still witty enough with him that he falls more in love with her, even though she doesn't actually like him that much. Which is a talent, I guess. But in chapter 33, Colonel Fitzwilliam reveals that Jane and Bingley were separated by Darcy. Darcy said, "No, you should not be hanging out with her. She doesn't actually love you. She's just being nice to you." He also provides us with the useful information that Darcy has been staying in Kent longer than Fitzwilliam had thought he was going to. And we don't know why this is. But then in chapter 34, Darcy arrives at the parsonage without ceremony and just proposes to Lizzie. And, oh, yep, that would do it. He's not expecting to be turned down. He is not expecting to be turned down, but that is what happens. This part, halfway through the book, is absolutely pivotal, because Lizzie, shortly after the proposal scene, gets the letter from Darcy which explains what happened with Wickham and why he broke up Jane and Bingley, but mostly the Wickham thing. She has to reevaluate all of her former prejudices, and he has just been told that he comes across as a jerk, and that he is high-handed and rude and proud and conceited, and how dare you, and he's reevaluating some of his life choices. Let's put it like that. A couple of months after this, Lizzie is with the Gardiners on a tour of Derbyshire, and she and Darcy run into each other again at his house. Awkward. A little bit awkward. Made even more awkward by the fact that the Bingleys are coming to stay too, and here's Caroline again. How is Caroline going to deal with this? Mostly silence. After sitting in this manner a quarter of an hour without hearing Miss Bingley's voice, Elizabeth was roused by receiving from her a cold inquiry after the health of her family. She answered with equal indifference and brevity, and the other said no more. But then Darcy joins them. No sooner did he appear than Elizabeth wisely resolved to be perfectly easy and unembarrassed, a resolution the more necessary to be made, but perhaps not the more easily kept, because she saw that the suspicions of the whole party were awakened against them, and that there was scarcely an eye which did not watch his behaviour when he first came into the room. In no countenance was attentive curiosity so strongly marked as in Miss Bingley's, in spite of the smiles which overspread her face when she spoke to one of its objects, for jealousy had not yet made her desperate, and her attentions to Mr. Darcy were by no means over. Miss Darcy, on her brother's entrance, exerted herself much more to talk, and Elizabeth saw that he was anxious for her sister and herself to get acquainted, and forwarded, as much as possible, every attempt at conversation on either side. Miss Bingley saw all this likewise, and in the imprudence of anger, took the first opportunity of saying it with sneering civility, "Pray, Miss Eliza, are not the whatever-shire militia removed from Meryton? They must be a great loss to your family." Now, in the book, she doesn't mention Wickham by name, she wouldn't dare, but in the miniseries, they have to, compress things a bit, so she does say something about Wickham while Georgiana is playing the piano, and I love that scene so much, because Georgiana stumbles on the piano, and Lizzie blames herself and kind of gets Georgiana out of this sort of sticky social situation. And then we have some stares of repressed British longing. The very circumstance which had been designed to turn his thoughts from Elizabeth seemed to have fixed them on her more, and more cheerfully. Listen, this is Jane Austen herself telling you that all of Caroline's machinations are just making Darcy fall more in love with Lizzie. What can I say? It's right here in the text. Caroline does have one last desperate go at it after the Gardiners leave. "How very ill Miss Eliza Bennet looks this morning, Mr. Darcy." Yeah, that's gonna go well. However little Mr. Darcy might have liked such an address, he contented himself with coolly replying that he perceived no other alteration than her being rather tanned. No miraculous consequence of travelling in the summer. No, that didn't work, so try insulting her appearance. Persuaded as Miss Bingley was that Darcy admired Elizabeth, this was not the best method of recommending herself, but angry people are not always wise, and in seeing him at last look somewhat nettled, she had all the success she expected. He was resolutely silent, however, and from a determination of making him speak, she continued. Oh dear.
It has been many months now since I have considered her one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance.
He then went away, and Miss Bingley was left to all the satisfaction of having forced him to say what gave no one any pain but herself. Poor Caroline. But you know what? Even she can learn. Even she can learn. Because most of the characters in the story learn at least something. Darcy obviously changes quite substantially. He discovers that his behaviour has actually been not great, even if his principles are reasonably sound, and so he becomes a better person. Lizzie discovers that generally she has pretty good judgment, but first impressions can be misleading, and so she becomes a better person. Jane is sweet and lovely at the beginning and sweet and lovely at the end, but even she is no longer taken in by Caroline and her pretensions of friendship. And, it has to be said, even Caroline can learn. Miss Bingley was very deeply mortified by Darcy's marriage, but as she thought it advisable to retain the right of visiting at Pemberley, she dropped all her resentment, was fonder than ever of Georgiana, almost as attentive to Darcy as heretofore, and paid off every arrear of civility to Elizabeth. The defence rests, gentle viewer. Caroline Bingley is not the nicest of characters, but she is absolutely instrumental in making Darcy recognise his feelings about Elizabeth, and possibly even develop them. She does more to help Lizzie marry advantageously than Lizzie's own marrying advantageously obsessed mother. Caroline Bingley, MVP. Now, if you wish to make the case for the Gardiners, or even Lady Catherine, possibly, in the comments as the most valuable player in Pride and Prejudice, then I can see that. I can see the arguments you would make for those. But I have such a soft spot for Caroline and her beautiful musical name that I sort of named a character in my book after her. So here we are. Caroline helps out consistently through quite a large proportion of the novel. The fact that she doesn't intend to is just what makes it funny. If you have persisted to the end of this video, then congratulations, clearly you are my kind of weirdo. My usual fodder is movie fight analysis or perhaps costume armor ranking with a tier list that has Just Stab Me Now right at the bottom. You may be wondering where the book title came from. If you enjoyed this and you're not usually into those things, you may want to give them a go. Why not? And of course, sometimes when I'm not doing that, I make video series which accidentally become Barnes & Noble best-selling books. Okay, that only happened once, but you never know. Don't forget to check the pinned comment to links for anything you might want, and hope to see you soon.